Hey guys, what made medieval streets so strange was not simply that they were dirty, but that the dirt was ordinary, expected, and woven into daily life so completely that most people barely saw it the way we would. A street that would look appalling to a modern passerby could still be, in its own time, a place of trade, gossip, work, prayer, and routine. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like really does help support the channel. If you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past, subscribing is a good way to keep them finding you. Now, to understand why medieval streets were so filthy and yet so normal, it helps to begin by setting aside one very modern assumption. People in medieval towns were not walking through filth because they had no standards at all, or because they were somehow uniquely indifferent to discomfort. The reality was more complicated, and in some ways more revealing. Their streets were dirty because the street itself had a very different meaning. It was not just a passage between buildings. It was an extension of the household, the workshop, the stable, the market stall, and sometimes even the dump. It carried the traffic of animals and carts, the overflow of domestic chores, the byproducts of trades, and the waste of bodies, both human and animal, all at once. To a modern viewer, that may sound like a recipe for chaos. And very often it was. But the medieval town was not designed around our idea of strict separation. The clean and the unclean, the private and the public, the useful and the unpleasant, lived close together. In a narrow lane, a butcher might slaughter animals not far from where children played. A household might empty wastewater into a gutter outside the door. Horses, pigs, dogs, and chickens moved through the same shared space as merchants, priests, laborers, widows, apprentices, and visitors from the countryside. What seems shocking is not simply the presence of dirt, but the constant mixing of categories we now try hard to keep apart. And yet, if we move too quickly into disgust, we miss the deeper point. Medieval people did notice bad smells. They did complain about blocked drains, rotting matter, and foul conditions. Town records, court orders, and civic regulations make that clear. Authorities sometimes fine people for throwing waste where it should not go, for obstructing waterways, or for allowing certain nuisances to build up. So this was not a world without complaint. It was a world in which complaint collided, day after day, with material limits. There were fewer reliable drainage systems, fewer paved surfaces, fewer organized collection systems, fewer resources for constant maintenance, and more animals living in direct contact with human life. Filth was not so much accepted as fully manageable, but endured as part of the price of urban living. A medieval street also looked different beneath the dirt. Many were unpaved or only partly paved. Even in towns with stone surfaces in central areas, upkeep was uneven. Ruts formed, mud collected, water pooled. After rain, the ground could soften into a thick, churned mixture of soil, straw, manure, food scraps, ash, and whatever else had entered it during the day. In dry weather, that same street might harden, crack, and send up dust. So the experience of the street was seasonal. One month it might be a muddy obstacle course, another a baked and stinking track. Weather was not a background detail here. It was one of the main forces shaping the physical reality of urban life. Rain in particular had a strange double effect. It could wash material along gutters and carry some waste away, but it could also turn everything underfoot into a more intimate kind of mess. Imagine a lane hemmed in by timber buildings, some with upper stories leaning outward, leaving less open sky above than we might expect. Water drips from roofs. Light is limited. Foot traffic is constant. Animals have passed through since dawn. Slops from the household have been tipped out not long before. Wheels have already cut grooves through the softened ground. By midday, the street is not just dirty in the abstract. It clings. It splashes. It follows people inside on boots, hems, and cartwheels. Filth did not remain neatly outdoors. This is one reason the medieval street mattered so much. It was not simply an unpleasant public zone that could be ignored once crossed. It actively entered homes, workshops, and halls. The boundary between exterior and interior was more porous than we often imagine. A shop opened directly onto the street. A stable communicated with it. A householder working at the threshold was practically in it already. Goods passed through it constantly. Grain, hides, firewood, ale, fish, wool, tools, and building materials. When a street became difficult, the town itself became difficult. Trade slowed. Walking became harder. Illness was more feared. Tempers could shorten. Civic frustration often grew not because people expected pristine order, but because they understood very well how much disorder cost them. Animal traffic played a major part in this story. A medieval town was not an urban world emptied of livestock. Horses and oxen hauled goods. Carts moved supplies. Pigs in some places wandered with unnerving freedom, feeding on refuse and acting, in a rough sense, as scavengers. Dogs roamed. Chickens pecked. Even where rules existed, enforcement was uneven. This meant the street was always being remade by hooves, droppings, noise, and movement. The filth of the road was not merely leftover waste lying still. It was a living system of circulation. What entered in the morning could be broken apart, spread, trampled, splashed, consumed, or carried elsewhere by evening. There is a temptation to think that if people simply cared enough, they would have solved this more thoroughly. But that assumes solutions were easily available. In reality, medieval towns had to balance effort, manpower, money, habit, and competing priorities. A town government might order a lane cleaned, a ditch cleared, or a drain reopened, but such tasks required labor and organization. Who would do it? Who would pay? Who would be blamed when the work failed? These are old questions, and they are often more important than the rules themselves. A written order promising cleanliness could look impressive in a record. The street outside might still be a sodden inconvenience. The trades clustered inside towns added their own layers. Tanners, dyers, butchers, fishmongers, brewers, fullers, and others worked with substances that smelled strong even under good conditions. Hides soaked, blood spilled, organic waste accumulated. Water used in processing had to go somewhere. Not every trade operated in the heart of town, and some were pushed to edges or specific districts, partly because of smell and pollution, but medieval urban space was dense and compromise was constant. Even when activities were regulated, byproducts could travel. Wastewater moved downhill. Odors drifted. Carts carried offal through shared roads. The cleanest intention could still end in a dirty lane. And this is where the real contradiction begins to take shape. Medieval streets were filthy not because nobody recognized disorder, but because streets had to do too many jobs at once. They were transport corridors, marketplaces, drainage channels, social spaces, and workspaces. A modern street is often imagined as a controlled surface meant primarily for movement. The medieval street was much more like an exposed seam in urban life, where all the pressures of the town surfaced together. That is why it seemed normal. Not pleasant, not ideal, but normal in the sense that it reflected reality. If the town was crowded, under-resourced, animal-powered, workshop-driven, and only partly regulated, the street would show all of that without mercy. For ordinary people, adapting to this environment was a practical skill. You learned where the ground was safer after rain. You learned which alleys were worse at certain hours. You lifted your clothing. You chose your footing. You avoided some gutters and stepped over others. You knew by smell what trade operated nearby before you saw the sign. You kept a sense of balance not just on uneven ground, but among constant intrusions. A child raised in such a town would have learned these habits early, the way a modern child learns traffic lights or pavement edges. What shocks us is precisely what becomes unremarkable when encountered every day. This quiet adaptation is one of the most revealing things about the medieval past. Human beings can normalize a great deal, not because they are foolish, but because routine changes the scale of what feels surprising. When discomfort is constant, it rarely arrives with dramatic music. It settles into the body. It becomes an inconvenience to manage rather than a spectacle to discuss. That does not mean people liked it. It means they built lives around it. They still bought and sold. They still hurried to church. They still argued, courted, prayed, borrowed, drank, worked, and celebrated. Life did not pause because the street was filthy. Life passed through the filth and kept its appointments. At night, the same streets could become even more uncertain, without modern lighting, and with weather and refuse altering the ground. Moving after dark was not simply gloomy. Could be physically risky. Pools of water, loose boards, discarded matter, or wandering animals could turn a familiar route into a hazard. This made urban darkness more intimate than the romantic versions we sometimes imagine. A medieval street at night was not just picturesque shadow around old buildings. It was a place where smell sharpened, footing worsened, and the line between the known and the hidden narrowed. Dirt was part of that uncertainty. You could not always see what you were stepping into until it was too late. And still, there was status even here. Wealthier districts might be better maintained. Some important thoroughfares received more attention than poorer lanes. Civic pride often focused on visible centers. Market squares, routes used for ceremony, places important to commerce or authority. But inequality did not erase the general problem. It only distributed inconvenience unevenly. Those with better shoes, servants, carts, or access to sturdier buildings could buffer themselves a little more effectively. Those without such protections lived closer to the consequences. This too made filthy streets feel normal. They were not only environmental facts. They were social facts, tied to hierarchy, labor, and who had the power to distance themselves from shared discomfort. There is also a deeper misunderstanding modern viewers often bring. We sometimes imagine cleanliness as a single universal value applied in all times the same way. But medieval people organized cleanliness differently. Personal washing, laundry, food purity, spiritual purity, household order, and street maintenance were not always treated as one seamless category. A person could care deeply about one form of cleanliness while tolerating another kind of dirt in the broader environment. That may sound inconsistent, but it is not really so strange. Modern societies do similar things, only with different boundaries. We tolerate some forms of large-scale pollution while being highly sensitive to domestic hygiene. The medieval world simply drew some of those lines elsewhere. So when people stepped into a filthy street, they were not necessarily stepping into a moral void. They were stepping into a familiar public environment shaped by limited infrastructure, mixed uses, animal dependence, and habitual negotiation. The street offended, but it also functioned. It stank, but it connected. It disgusted, but it fed the town. That tension is what makes the subject more interesting than a simple catalog of unpleasant details. The dirt itself matters less than what it reveals about how people lived with constraint. And perhaps one of the more unsettling truths is that the medieval street was honest. It displayed the processes that supported life rather than hiding them neatly behind walls and distant systems. Waste, labor, transport, slaughter, craft, weather, and crowding all left visible marks. Modern cities are cleaner partly because much of the mess has been moved elsewhere, underground, out of sight, or onto the margins. Medieval towns had fewer ways to hide their workings. The street carried evidence of everything. That did not mean people never imagined improvement. Some authorities invested in paving. Some communities organized cleaning duties. Some regulations showed genuine concern for public nuisance and health, even if their language and assumptions differed from ours. The desire for a more manageable urban environment was real, but progress was uneven, fragile, and often reversible. A heavy rain, a blocked drain, a busy market, or a neglected ditch could undo order quickly. Cleanliness, where it existed, was not a permanent condition. It had to be fought for again and again with limited tools, which brings us to a small but telling irony. The more active and economically useful a street was, the more likely it could become unpleasant. A thriving market area attracted animals, carts, buyers, waste, noise, and constant wear. Success itself helped produce mess. A street empty of traffic might be cleaner in one sense, but it would also be less important. So filth could be, at least partly, the shadow of vitality. That does not romanticize it. Nobody needed deeper mud to prove prosperity. But it does remind us that inconvenience and usefulness were often linked. The busiest parts of town were busy because life happened there, and life left traces. If you ever find yourself imagining medieval towns as static museum scenes, this is the detail that corrects that picture. Their streets were active, pressured, imperfect systems. They changed hour by hour. Morning deliveries altered them. Market crowds compressed them. Rain transformed them. Animals renewed the problem constantly. Trades added layer after layer. By evening, the street was not simply dirty in the same way it had been at dawn. It had lived a full day, and that daily remaking shaped the psychology of the people who used it. Caution became ordinary. Tolerance became practical. Complaint became selective. You saved your outrage for what truly disrupted life, because there was little value in acting scandalized by conditions everyone already knew. That may be the most normal part of all. People do not spend all day reacting dramatically to the environment they depend on. They absorb it, work around it, and reserve their energy for the moments when the ordinary finally becomes too much. So to understand why medieval streets were so filthy and so normal, we have to hold two truths together. They were unpleasant in ways that are hard for us to imagine comfortably, and they were woven so fully into the routines of urban life that they ceased to be remarkable most of the time. The street was dirty because the town was alive. The dirt remained because removing it completely was beyond the reach of most communities. And people accepted it, not because they lacked noses, eyes, or standards, but because daily life rarely offers the luxury of total escape from its own byproducts. Once we see that, another question begins to emerge. If the street was carrying so much of urban life on its surface, then what happened when the pressures grew worse? When population thickened, trade intensified, animals multiplied, drains failed, and authorities tried, with mixed success, to impose order on a world that kept slipping back into mud, smell, and motion. That was often the moment when a medieval town discovered how thin the line was between ordinary inconvenience and genuine urban crisis. A muddy lane was one thing, a blocked drain in summer, when heat thickened every smell and slowed every movement, was something else entirely. What had been tolerated as background could suddenly become urgent. And when that happened, the street stopped being merely a place people passed through and became a political problem. Town governments, especially in the growing commercial centers of late medieval Europe, spent more time worrying about streets than we might expect. Their records are full of surprisingly practical concerns. Who was responsible for repairing paving stones? Who had allowed refuse to pile too high near a market? Who had built too far into a lane and narrowed public passage? Who had let a pig roam where it should not? Who had dumped waste where rain could carry it into the town's water supply? These were not glamorous matters, but they were the mechanics of urban survival. In places like London, York, Paris, Florence, or smaller trading towns across England, France, the Low Countries, and the German states, officials repeatedly issued orders about waste disposal. Some of these instructions sound remarkably familiar. Do not throw refuse into the street. Do not block the gutter. Do not leave animal remains to rot near a public way. Do not dump waste into the wrong ditch. The repetition itself tells a story. If authorities had to keep saying the same thing, it usually meant people kept doing it. This was not always simple laziness. Often it was geography. If your home sat above a narrow lane with limited drainage, where exactly should wastewater go? If you worked in a trade that produced blood, scraps, ashes, or spoiled material, how far could you realistically transport it every day? If you owned animals and the town relied on them, how much control was practical? Regulation could declare a clean ideal. Daily life had to negotiate the distance between ideal and possible. Even paving, which sounds like a straightforward solution, was far more complicated than it first appears. Stone paving improved major roads and market areas, but laying and maintaining it required money, labor, and constant attention. Heavy carts broke surfaces. Rain undermined edges. Repairs demanded coordination. In some towns, householders were expected to maintain the stretch of street outside their own property. This sounds efficient until one imagines what happened when neighbors had unequal wealth, unequal willingness, or long-running disputes. One repaired section beside one neglected one created its own awkward geography. A paved road also did not eliminate filth. It changed its behavior. Instead of sinking into deep mud, waste might collect in gutters or slick across stone. Drainage became more important, not less. The success of paving depended on channels, slopes, and regular clearing. A blocked gutter could turn expensive improvement into a shallow, foul basin. Urban maintenance was not a single victory. It was an endless argument with water, and water was always at the center of the matter. Most medieval towns depended on a delicate relationship with wells, rivers, streams, and cisterns. Water had to be close enough for daily use but protected enough to remain usable. This was not easy when streets carried so much waste. A butcher's runoff, a tannery's discharge, household slops, stable drainage, and human waste all threatened contamination. People may not have understood disease in modern microbiological terms, but they understood corruption. Bad smells, foul taste, visible impurity, these mattered. Water that looked or smelled wrong inspired fear. This helps explain why some regulations were so strict about dumping near certain areas. It was not simply about appearance. It was about survival. A polluted well could threaten an entire neighborhood. A fouled river crossing could disrupt trade and daily routine. Even where people lacked modern scientific explanations, they recognized patterns. Places that smelled wrong often felt dangerous. Places where waste gathered were associated with sickness, weakness, and social neglect. But even here there was contradiction. The same river that carried waste away might also provide drinking water downstream. The same ditch that served as drainage might become stagnant in dry weather. A town could depend on the very system that endangered it. Medieval urban life was full of these uneasy compromises. Solutions were rarely clean. They were often just slightly better arrangements of unavoidable problems. One of the clearest examples of this was the open gutter. Many medieval streets had shallow channels running along their sides, or sometimes through the center, designed to carry wastewater and rain runoff away from houses and toward larger drains or nearby water sources. In theory, this was practical. In practice, it depended on flow. When water moved, the gutter functioned. When it slowed, clogged, or overflowed, it became part of the problem. Food scraps, ash, straw, dung, and heavier waste could settle there. Animals disturbed it. Children stepped near it. Wheels splashed through it. The gutter was both infrastructure and daily nuisance. Imagine standing at your doorway early in the morning. The street is beginning to wake. A brewer's cart passes, wheels already dark with mud. Someone nearby empties yesterday's wash water. A pig noses near the edge of the gutter. A dog moves faster, more purposeful. The smell shifts as the air warms. Somewhere, a fishmonger has already opened. Somewhere else, a baker is working before dawn. Bells sound from a church tower. Life is beginning, and the gutter is part of that life. Not hidden from it, but fully visible, like the street's own bloodstream. It is tempting to see this only as evidence of hardship, but it was also evidence of density. Medieval towns were crowded because they were useful. People came for trade, for protection, for work, for legal rights, for opportunity unavailable in scattered rural life. The filth of the street was partly the cost of concentration. Town air might smell worse, but town life offered wages, markets, guilds, patrons, and possibilities. That is why so many people accepted conditions that seem intolerable from a distance. They were not choosing between a filthy street and a clean street. They were choosing between one form of difficulty and another. Rural poverty had its own brutal realities: hunger, isolation, dependence, seasonal vulnerability. Urban discomfort at least came with access to money, networks, and sometimes mobility. Mud was unpleasant, but it could also be the mud of economic chance. Visitors often noticed this contrast sharply. Someone arriving from the countryside might be struck by the smell before anything else. Foreign travelers sometimes commented on the density, noise, and physical closeness of urban life. Yet they also saw wealth concentrated there. Cloth, imported spices, fine metalwork, church treasures, legal courts, education, and social ambition. Medieval towns were rarely beautiful in the polished sense later centuries preferred. Their power was more immediate. They were alive. And because they were alive, they were noisy in ways we often forget. Filth and sound belonged together. Hooves on stone, cartwheels grinding through wet ruts, vendors shouting, dogs barking, smiths hammering, church bells marking time, people arguing at thresholds, animals protesting their own movement. The street was not a silent medieval painting. It was a working machine, and dirt was one of its byproducts. Night changed that rhythm but did not erase it. Refuse remained. Animals still moved. People returning late stepped carefully. Watchmen, where they existed, listened as much as they looked. Darkness made smell stronger and footing more uncertain. Without widespread street lighting, familiar paths could become hostile. Lantern light was limited, expensive, and fragile. Rain after sunset could transform a manageable route into something almost humiliating. One wrong step, one unnoticed ditch, and the street announced its authority over everyone equally. There was also embarrassment attached to this world, though not always in the way we might expect. Reputation mattered deeply in medieval communities. Keeping a respectable household included attention to thresholds, entrances, and visible order. A doorway overflowing with neglect reflected badly on the people inside. Merchants cared how customers approached their shops. Wealthier families cared how visitors perceived their streets. Cleanliness was social, not merely personal. This created strange little negotiations. A person might tolerate general street filth while fiercely defending the stretch directly outside their home. Neighbors argued over whose waste had crossed whose boundary. Responsibility was local before it was civic. People cared intensely about small distances. One gutter could divide not just water flow but social blame. And blame mattered because punishment could be public. Fines were common, but so was the simple humiliation of being known as the person who made a street worse. In tightly connected towns, reputation was currency. A complaint about refuse could easily become a complaint about character. Was this person careless? Dishonest? Neglectful? Disorder in the street could become moral language. At the same time, the wealthy were not magically cleaner. Wealth changed exposure, not reality itself. A prosperous merchant might have better paving near his property, servants to manage unpleasant tasks, stronger shoes, and greater access to private spaces. But he still lived in a town whose systems were shared. His goods still moved through muddy roads. His horses still added to the problem. His household still depended on the same vulnerable infrastructure. Privilege could soften the edges, but it rarely created true separation. And sometimes the very symbols of wealth made the street worse. Grander households meant more deliveries, more servants, more animals, more kitchen waste, more visible traffic. Prosperity had a physical footprint. The richer the town became, the more pressure its streets often carried. This is where medieval urban life begins to feel surprisingly modern. Cities still struggle with the same hidden argument: who benefits from density and who absorbs its discomfort, who enjoys the convenience and who cleans the consequences. Medieval streets made that argument visible every single day. Waste was not abstract. It sat underfoot. There is a reason plague years made people look at streets differently. When epidemic disease arrived, ordinary dirt could suddenly feel sinister. Habits once tolerated came under sharper suspicion. Authorities searched for causes in air, smell, corruption, and contact. Filthy streets did not create plague in the simplistic way later imagination sometimes suggests, but they became part of how people understood danger. Rot and disease seemed morally and physically connected. A foul-smelling lane was no longer just unpleasant. Felt ominous. This changed enforcement. Cleaning efforts could intensify. Certain trades were watched more closely. Public anxiety turned attention toward spaces previously endured without much drama. Fear sharpened the senses. What had been normal became newly threatening. And yet, even then, life could not stop. Markets still needed food. Animals still needed feeding. Waste still had to go somewhere. Illness did not suspend infrastructure. It exposed how fragile it already was. That tension between fear and necessity would shape some of the most revealing moments in medieval town life, especially when authorities tried to impose order on streets that were never designed to be fully controlled, and when ordinary people had to decide which rules could be obeyed and which were simply too expensive to follow. And that was often where medieval civic life became unexpectedly personal, because every rule about the street eventually arrived at someone's door. It is easy to imagine city regulations as distant proclamations from officials in robes, but much of urban order depended on ordinary householders being told very specifically to move something, repair something, stop doing something, or pay for something they would rather ignore. A drain blocked outside your house was not an abstract municipal concern. It was your problem and very often your expense. Many towns placed legal responsibility for street maintenance directly on residents and property owners. If the paving outside your frontage had broken, if your gutter overflowed, if refuse from your household created a nuisance, you could be fined or summoned. This sounds sensible until we remember how unstable medieval property could be. Houses were rented, subdivided, inherited, contested, or shared. Workshops and living spaces overlapped. Responsibility could become wonderfully unclear at exactly the moment money was required. Who should pay for repairs if a tenant caused the problem but the landlord owned the structure? Who should clear the drain if runoff came from 3 houses uphill? Who was at fault if a butcher's waste passed by a baker's door? These were not just technical questions. They were daily arguments, and they reveal something important. Cleanliness was never only about hygiene. It was about power, negotiation, and whose inconvenience mattered enough to be enforced. Street courts and civic complaints were full of these small battles. A neighbor accused another of throwing waste too near a shared wall. A shopkeeper protested that a nearby dung heap drove customers away. Someone extended a staircase or storage space too far into a lane, narrowing passage and forcing carts into deeper mud. A stable leaked into a public way. Privy drained badly. None of these issues were grand history in the traditional sense, but together they formed the actual texture of urban life. And perhaps more importantly, they shaped how people understood fairness. Because if your neighbor ignored the rules while you paid to follow them, resentment grew quickly. Urban order depended on a fragile sense that burdens were shared. Once people believed some households could escape responsibility through wealth, connections, or stubbornness, the street became not just dirty, but unjust. Complaints about mud often carried hidden complaints about privilege. This is one reason medieval authorities could be surprisingly aggressive about enforcement. Public order was visible. A blocked lane embarrassed the town. A foul market offended visitors and merchants. A dangerous bridge or impassable road threatened revenue. Officials were not only defending cleanliness. They were defending the credibility of urban government itself. Some towns appointed officers specifically concerned with inspection and nuisance. Others relied on guild pressure, parish influence, or rotating civic duties. Labor for repairs might be demanded from residents, or special taxes raised for paving and drainage projects. In theory, everyone benefited. In practice, everyone argued about whether the burden was distributed fairly. There is something almost timeless in this. Cities have always depended on invisible cooperation, and people have always noticed when cooperation feels one-sided. Consider the simple matter of dung. Manure was not merely waste. It had value. In agricultural societies, it could be sold, collected, or reused. This created a strange relationship with something deeply unpleasant. Too much dung in the wrong place was a nuisance. Dung properly gathered could be an asset. So removal was not simply disposal. It was part of an economy. This meant the street was not just suffering from waste. It was participating in systems of reuse. Sweepings, ash, animal droppings, spoiled straw, and other refuse might eventually leave town for gardens or fields. What looked like worthless filth could still be material with purpose. The problem was timing. Between useful collection and practical reuse, there was often an unpleasant period when it sat exactly where people did not want it. That delay defined much of medieval discomfort. Things were not necessarily abandoned forever. They were waiting to be moved, sold, burned, buried, washed away, or reused. And in that waiting, the street did its quiet, unpleasant work of holding the overflow of urban life. Human waste, of course, made the problem sharper. The popular imagination tends to reduce medieval sanitation to people simply throwing chamber pots from windows at random, but reality was more structured, though not always much cleaner. Many houses had privies, basic latrine spaces, sometimes connected to pits or cesspools. Larger households, monasteries, castles, and some urban buildings developed more elaborate arrangements, but these systems required maintenance. Pits filled. Cesspools overflowed. Someone had to empty them. This was work, and it was work people preferred not to think about. Night soil collectors, gong farmers in England, and similar laborers elsewhere handled some of the least glamorous but most necessary tasks in urban life. They worked in conditions most people tried not to imagine, clearing cesspits and removing waste that could not simply remain where it was. Their labor reminds us of something important. Medieval cities were not held together by elegant systems, but by people willing or forced to do deeply unpleasant work. And like many essential workers across history, they were both necessary and socially distanced. People relied on them but did not admire them. Their presence was a reminder of the physical truths polite society preferred to push aside. This also helps explain why smell mattered so much. Modern discussions of sanitation often focus on germs, but medieval people lived more directly inside a world interpreted through scent. Smell was evidence. A foul odor suggested corruption, danger, imbalance, moral disorder, or at least practical neglect. Sweet smells, clean air, herbs, incense, and fresh movement of wind were associated with health and safety. Stagnation felt threatening. This does not mean they were simply wrong because they lacked germ theory. Smell often was a useful warning sign. Rotting organic matter, spoiled water, and neglected waste were genuinely dangerous environments. Their explanation differed from ours, but their instincts were often grounded in repeated experience. This made the street emotionally charged in a way modern paved roads often are not. To walk through a foul lane was not just physically unpleasant. It could feel spiritually and bodily unhealthy. Air itself seemed contaminated. The city pressed against the senses, and still people adapted. There is a quiet discipline in ordinary adaptation that history often overlooks. You learned when to open windows and when not to. You learned which side of the street was safer after rain. You knew when the fish market would be worst. You timed errands around weather, market hours, and local routines. You stored herbs. You burned rushes. You accepted some discomfort and fought smaller battles where you could. This practical intelligence mattered more than ideal rules. Urban survival often depended less on perfect systems than on intimate knowledge. A widow running a small household knew which neighbor's drainage caused trouble after storms. An apprentice carrying goods across town knew which lane flooded first. A servant sent for bread knew how to protect hems from the worst sections of road. A merchant understood that appearance mattered and might pay for the entrance to his shop to be cleaner than the lane beyond it. These were not dramatic acts. They were the daily management of imperfect reality. Even clothing reflected this relationship. Long garments, valuable shoes, and expensive fabrics met the street with constant tension. Keeping clothing respectable was difficult when streets fought against respectability. Mud-stained hems, leather-absorbed wet filth. Fine garments needed lifting, protection, or servants to help preserve them. Fashion was never separate from infrastructure. This is one reason status displayed itself not only in fabric quality, but in the ability to avoid damage. Riding instead of walking, entering through cleaner courtyards, having others carry burdens, owning multiple garments. Wealth did not remove the street, but it reduced how much of it touched your body. For the poor, there was less distance. Exposure was more immediate, and dignity required more effort. This is worth remembering because modern imagination often romanticizes medieval streets visually. Stone walls, lantern glow, market color, while forgetting the exhausting labor required simply to remain presentable inside that environment. Respectability was not a costume. It was maintenance against conditions working constantly against it. Religious life intersected with this too. Processions, feast days, funerals, and church-going all moved through streets that were materially ordinary and symbolically important. Sacred movement passed through mud. Priests and parishioners navigated the same physical inconveniences as everyone else. Towns sometimes cleaned important routes more carefully before major events, not just for convenience, but for dignity. Ceremony demanded a temporary victory over disorder. That temporary victory says a great deal. It shows that people knew perfectly well what a cleaner street could mean. Order was admired. Fresh paving, cleared gutters, swept approaches to churches or guild halls. These signaled competence and civic pride. They were visible proof that a town could govern itself. But they were often temporary because maintaining them required continuous effort against continuous pressure. Rain returned. Animals returned. Markets returned. Refuse returned. The street, in a sense, was always trying to become itself again. And sometimes fire interrupted everything. Medieval towns feared fire for obvious reasons. Dense timber buildings, open flames, workshops, kitchens, candles, and close construction made urban fires terrifyingly common. But after fire came rebuilding, and rebuilding meant streets changed. Rubble blocked passage. Temporary structures crowded lanes. New paving might be laid, or old boundaries contested. Disaster created brief opportunities for improvement and equally powerful chances for new disorder. A burned district could emerge cleaner, wider, and better organized, or simply more chaotic in a different way. This reminds us that medieval streets were never fixed. They were negotiated landscapes, built, damaged, repaired, narrowed, widened, obstructed, and argued over across generations. The filth was part of that history, but so was constant human effort to shape it. If we follow that effort closely enough, we begin to see something else. The street was also a stage for reputation and control. Who kept order? Who ignored it? Who had the authority to complain? Who was expected to endure? And nowhere did that become clearer than in the market itself, where food, money, status, regulation, and filth all collided in the same crowded space, and where the difference between ordinary inconvenience and real danger could be measured not in abstract civic pride, but in what people were willing to eat. Because in the market, filth was no longer just something underfoot. It was something that could reach the table, enter the body, and quietly shape trust between buyer and seller. A muddy road was inconvenient. Spoiled meat, contaminated water, or bread made in unhealthy conditions felt far more personal. The street and the stomach were never as separate as people like to imagine. The medieval market was one of the busiest and most tightly watched spaces in town. It was where strangers met locals, where news traveled beside goods, where farmers entered urban life for a day, and where the practical business of survival happened in full public view. Bread, fish, meat, ale, cheese, onions, herbs, eels, poultry, salt, cloth, candles, tools. Everything essential moved through this crowded choreography. And because food was both necessity and risk, regulation became intense. Authorities inspected weights and measures. Bakers could be punished for dishonest loaves. Brewers were watched for quality and pricing. Butchers were expected to manage slaughter and waste with at least some discipline. Fishmongers dealt in products that turned dangerous quickly, especially in warmer months. Markets were not simply places of exchange. They were places where trust had to be performed constantly. This performance was fragile because the physical conditions were difficult from the start. Fresh meat did not arrive in refrigerated wagons. Fish had to move quickly or become suspect. Blood, scales, bones, feathers, spoiled scraps, and wastewater accumulated rapidly. Animals arrived alive, were sold, slaughtered, and processed within the same urban ecosystem. The smells were immediate and undeniable. Market success depended not on eliminating these realities, but on managing them just well enough that trade could continue. This is why butchers were both necessary and often pushed to the edge of polite urban comfort. The butcher's trade was central. People needed meat, and livestock required handling close to where people lived. But slaughter was messy, loud, and impossible to sanitize in the modern sense. Blood had to drain somewhere. Offal had to be removed. Hides and bones entered other trades. Dogs hovered nearby with professional patience. Flies arrived without invitation. Some towns tried to concentrate butchers in specific districts, often near water sources useful for cleaning and carrying waste away. This was partly practical and partly social. Certain smells belonged at a distance, even if that distance was only a few streets. Yet boundaries were never perfect. Blood moved downhill. Waste traveled. Odor ignored administrative lines. The fish market created its own kind of anxiety. Fish was central to medieval diets, especially because religious fasting rules made meatless days common across much of Christian Europe. That meant fish was not an occasional luxury but a regular necessity for many people. Fresh fish, salted fish, river fish, sea fish, eels, shellfish, all moved through towns with varying speed and quality. And fish punishes delay. Even now, people trust their instincts with fish. In the medieval world, where preservation was limited and transport slower, that instinct mattered even more. A bad fish could be more than unpleasant, could be dangerous. Market inspection was not merely about fairness. It was about keeping confidence alive in a product that decayed visibly and smelled like accusation. Bread, meanwhile, carried a different kind of emotional weight. Bread was not just food. It was expectation, social stability, and often the first measure by which ordinary people judged whether a town was functioning properly. If bread became scarce, expensive, or visibly poor in quality, anxiety spread quickly. Bread touched everyone. Bakers, therefore, occupied an unusually sensitive position. The famous assize of bread in England and similar systems elsewhere reflected how seriously authorities treated loaf size, pricing, and quality. A dishonest baker was not simply cheating customers. He was threatening the moral order of the market. And here again, the street entered the story. Flour had to travel through muddy roads. Firewood for ovens came through the same difficult streets. Water quality affected dough. Rats threatened storage. Rain complicated transport. A baker's reputation might depend partly on conditions far beyond his own shop. Urban infrastructure was never background. To shape taste, price, and trust. Ale was even more intimate. In many medieval towns, ale and beer were safer daily choices than questionable water sources, especially when brewing involved boiling. This did not make every cup healthy or every brewer honest, but it made brewing central to ordinary life. Households brewed, professionals brewed, taverns depended on it, travelers judged places by it. Alewives and brewers were watched carefully because poor drink meant more than disappointment. It meant suspicion. Was the water bad? Was the brew weak? Had ingredients been stretched too far? Was this incompetence or greed? People cared deeply because drinking was not a luxury ritual. It was woven into labor, meals, hospitality, and routine. The quality of drink was the quality of daily life. This created a market culture where cleanliness, honesty, and reputation blended together in fascinating ways. People did not expect perfection. They expected recognizable standards. A little mud on vegetables was ordinary. A little chaos in a market square was expected. But there was a line even if it shifted by season and circumstance. Cross that line and ordinary filth became scandal. This was especially true during summer heat. Warm months sharpened every problem. Meat turned faster. Water stagnated. Flies multiplied. Smells thickened in narrow streets where air moved badly. Refuse that might be merely unpleasant in winter became oppressive. The market in summer was not just busier. It was more fragile. People noticed. Complaints increased. Authorities worried more. A single neglected heap of waste could feel like an insult to the entire neighborhood. Heat made patience shorter. And yet, summer was also when roads improved for transport, when produce arrived in greater abundance, when trade intensified. Prosperity and nuisance grew together. The same season that brought fresh vegetables and fuller markets also brought stronger smells and greater risk. Medieval life repeatedly refused the comfort of simple categories. The market also revealed hierarchy with remarkable clarity. The wealthy could choose earlier, fresher, better-positioned goods. They had servants to shop, storage to preserve, kitchens to manage preparation, and enough money to reject suspicious products. The poor often bought later, cheaper, and with less room for caution. If meat was slightly questionable but affordable, refusal was a luxury. This matters because discussions of medieval filth can become too universal. Not everyone experienced the same street the same way. Not everyone faced the same risks. Dirt was shared, but vulnerability was not. A merchant's daughter stepping carefully to church and a laborer hauling barrels through the same lane did not inhabit the street equally. One could avoid more of its consequences. The other carried them home on clothes, skin, and wages. This difference shaped dignity. To remain respectable in a dirty environment required resources. Spare garments, better footwear, stronger walls, cleaner courtyards, private wells, access to enclosed spaces. Poverty meant fewer buffers between the body and the street. Cleanliness was partly moral language, but it was also material privilege. This helps explain why accusations about dirt could become accusations about class. To call a place filthy was sometimes to imply its people were disorderly. To condemn a district could mean condemning its residents. Urban language about nuisance often carried social judgment disguised as practical concern. Some neighborhoods were watched more harshly than others. Some trades were tolerated when profitable and condemned when politically convenient. The street was never neutral. Even entertainment passed through this tension. Festivals, fairs, public punishments, religious processions, royal entries, and seasonal celebrations all used the same streets people cursed on ordinary mornings. Temporary beauty was laid over permanent inconvenience. Streets were swept for important occasions. Decorations were hung. Mud was managed, if only briefly. Public ceremony demanded the illusion that order could be complete. And that illusion mattered. It reminded people what the town wanted to believe about itself, that it was governed, prosperous, respectable, worthy of pride. For a few hours, perhaps a few days, the street could become a statement rather than a complaint. Then the carts returned. Animals returned. Rain returned. There is something almost tender in that repeated effort. People knew perfection would not last, but they still prepared for feast days, still swept for weddings, still cleared routes for funerals and holy processions. Cleanliness was sometimes less about permanent victory than about moments of dignity. That may be one of the most human parts of the story. We often imagine medieval filth as a sign of indifference, but much of it existed alongside constant attempts to create islands of order. Inside homes, near churches, around markets, before ceremonies. People cared. They simply cared inside limits. And those limits were tested hardest when weather turned against them. A long wet season could undo months of work. Roads softened beyond repair. Wagons stuck. Market supplies slowed. Prices shifted. Refuse spread wider. A harsh winter froze some problems and intensified others. Ice over drains, rotting stores, difficulty removing waste. Animals kept closer to living quarters. Every season rearranged the balance between tolerance and crisis. Urban life required seasonal intelligence as much as legal control. A town did not remain clean by rule alone. It survived because people adjusted constantly, lifting hems, changing routes, storing differently, buying faster, complaining strategically, enduring what could not be fixed. Civilization, in this sense, was not stone walls and charters. It was repeated adaptation to inconvenience. And perhaps nowhere was that adaptation more visible than at the very edge of the street itself, the threshold between public dirt and private order, where every household fought its own small battle to keep the outside world from crossing too far inside. That threshold was more important than it first appears, because for most people, cleanliness was not measured by the entire town. It was measured by the few feet between the street and the place where they slept, cooked, prayed, and tried to preserve a sense of order. Medieval households could not control the whole city, but they could fight for the dignity of a doorway. The entrance to a home was never just practical architecture. It was a boundary between exposure and protection, reputation and privacy, public judgment and private life. If the street represented shared disorder, the threshold represented resistance. Sweeping the step, clearing the gutter nearby, keeping refuse from gathering too close, these were not small gestures. They were daily declarations that one's household was disciplined, respectable, and still in command of itself. This mattered especially in towns where neighbors watched each other constantly. A medieval street was a place of observation. People noticed who rose early, who kept animals badly, whose children ran wild, whose shutters stayed closed too long, whose servant dumped wash water carelessly, whose guests arrived late at night. Privacy existed, but it was thinner than we often imagine. Reputation lived in public habits. That made the doorstep symbolic. A neglected entrance could be read as laziness, poverty, illness, widowhood, misfortune, or moral failure depending on who was looking and what story they wanted to tell. A carefully kept threshold suggested competence and social stability, even if the household inside was struggling. In that sense, cleanliness became a language. You could not fully escape the smell of the street, but you could arrange your own relationship to it. Rushes might be spread inside and changed regularly. Herbs could be hung for scent and comfort. Floors were swept. Laundry was managed with great effort. Bedding was aired when possible. Smoke from the hearth had its own strange role, unpleasant in one way, protective in another, drying the house, discouraging some pests, preserving food. Domestic cleanliness was rarely the absence of strong smells. It was the management of them. This is one place where modern assumptions can mislead us badly. People often imagine medieval homes as simply filthy by default, as though dirt flowed indoors and remained unquestioned. But household order mattered intensely. Linen was valuable. Bedding represented comfort and status. Storage had to protect food from rats and damp. Water had to be carried and used carefully. Cleanliness was labor, and because labor was costly, people paid attention to it. The challenge was that the outside world kept insisting on entry. Shoes brought mud. Animals were often close, sometimes inside shared structures or immediately beside them. Smoke blackened interiors. Rain leaked through weak roofs. Fleas, lice, mice, and rats ignored social ambition. A household might work constantly to maintain order and still feel only partially successful. This was not failure. It was normal life under difficult conditions. Consider footwear alone. A person returning from market did not simply walk in and forget the road. Shoes carried the street with them. Mud, dung, wet straw, and whatever else the lane had offered came directly to the threshold. In wealthier households, servants might help manage this transition. In poorer homes, it was handled with less ceremony but equal necessity. The street had to be negotiated every time someone entered. Clothing suffered the same argument. Hems dragged. Cloaks collected damp and smell. Aprons absorbed work. Wool held weather. Leather remembered every puddle. Washing garments was expensive in time, water, fuel, and labor. Clothing could not be treated casually. Preserving it meant managing the street itself as much as possible. This gives us a clearer picture of why some medieval complaints sound so specific. People argued over puddles near doorways because those puddles reached their beds. They complained about blocked drains because blocked drains entered kitchens. The city was intimate. Public inconvenience became private burden very quickly. Windows and upper floors also played their part. In many urban houses, upper stories projected outward over narrow lanes, creating the famous leaning appearance still romanticized in old streets today. Beautiful in postcards, perhaps, but practically complicated. Less sunlight reached the ground. Air circulation could be poor. Moisture lingered. Sounds traveled upward and inward. Smells rose. What looks picturesque from a distance often meant a darker, closer, more crowded daily life. And from those upper windows came another layer of negotiation. Households had to dispose of wastewater somehow. Chamber pots, wash water, kitchen refuse, none of it vanished politely. Regulations often tried to control when and where disposal happened, but enforcement and reality rarely matched perfectly. The famous image of waste simply being thrown from windows at random is exaggerated, but the broader truth remains. Urban disposal systems were inconsistent, and gravity was a powerful temptation. Even where care existed, accidents existed too. This made movement through town a matter of practical awareness. You did not only watch the ground, you watched above. A narrow street demanded attention in all directions. Modern pedestrians worry about traffic. Medieval pedestrians worried about architecture, animals, drainage, and the habits of their neighbors. There is something almost humbling in how much intelligence ordinary movement required. To walk well in a medieval town meant understanding invisible routines. When shops opened, where deliveries blocked lanes, which households emptied water early, where butchers worked, which routes were safer after rain, where pigs liked to gather, which church path was worth the longer distance because the shorter one had become impossible. Local knowledge was infrastructure. Visitors lacked that knowledge and suffered for it. Travelers arriving from outside could quickly reveal themselves not just by accent or clothing, but by how they moved. Hesitation, wrong turns, poor footing, visible surprise at ordinary conditions, these marked outsiders. Townspeople moved with the confidence of habit, stepping around problems they barely registered consciously. This also shaped childhood. Children learned the street early because the street was not a separate adult environment. It was part of the household world. Errands began young. Awareness of animals, gutters, dangerous carts, market rhythms, and neighborhood boundaries formed practical education. What we might call street sense was literal and necessary. And yet, despite all this familiarity, fear remained. Not constant panic, but a background awareness that disorder could suddenly become more than inconvenience. A fall into bad water, spoiled food, a spreading sickness, a dangerous fire beginning in a cluttered lane, a flood after heavy rain. Small failures could become larger threats quickly. Medieval resilience did not come from believing everything was safe. It came from living with the expectation that stability was always partial. This is why civic bells mattered. Church bells marked prayer and time, yes, but bells also announced danger, fire, emergency, urgent gathering. In dense towns, the street could transform from ordinary routine to collective alarm with astonishing speed. One moment, a market lane. The next, a chain of shouted warnings, buckets passing hand to hand, animals panicking, smoke thickening between timber walls. Filth played a role even here. Cluttered streets slowed movement. Narrow lanes trapped people. Waste and building materials created obstacles during crisis. Urban disorder was never just aesthetic. It shaped survival. And still, after disaster, people rebuilt. This repeated rebuilding is easy to overlook. Medieval towns were not static ruins waiting to be discovered by modern tourists. They were constantly repaired by hands that expected damage. A broken drain was fixed. A wall was patched. A lane was cleared. A market resumed. There was no final moment of completion. There was only maintenance. This might be the truest definition of normality in medieval streets. Not that filth was ignored, but that it was fought without expectation of permanent victory. People woke, swept, complained, repaired, argued, adapted, and did it again the next morning. Guilds contributed to this rhythm as well. Trades did not exist only as economic groups. They shaped the physical character of neighborhoods. Streets near smiths sounded and smelled different from streets near bakers or dyers. Certain areas carried reputations tied to their work. Apprentices, deliveries, workshop waste, and customer traffic gave each district its own personality. This meant a town could be mapped partly by the senses. You knew where you were by noise before sight, by smell before signage. The sweet warmth of bread, the sharpness of tanning, the metallic rhythm of ironwork, the wet smell near fish stalls. Urban identity was physical. People belonged to these sensory geographies. Home was not just an address. It was the familiar arrangement of sounds and odors that told your body where it was. That familiarity made social judgment sharper. If a respectable merchant moved into a lane known for noisier trades, people noticed. If a poorer family occupied space near a prosperous market frontage, assumptions followed. Streets carried status. They could elevate or embarrass. Marriage negotiations, apprenticeships, and business trust were influenced by these quiet geographies. Where you lived said something before you spoke. Was your doorway near the parish church or beside the slaughter yard? Was your household approached by a clean paved route or through a difficult muddy lane? Geography became biography, and this, perhaps, explains why street improvement could feel so emotionally charged. Paving a lane was not merely technical. It changed how people imagined themselves. A cleaner approach to a church, a broader road to a market, a repaired bridge. These were promises of dignity. People invested pride in surfaces, not because stone itself was magical, but because it suggested permanence in a world that often felt improvised. Better streets implied better futures. They hinted that the town was becoming more stable, more respectable, more worthy of memory. Yet permanence was always challenged by nature, by poverty, and by sheer human density. Improvement never ended the argument. It simply moved it forward. And as towns grew larger in the later medieval centuries, that argument became harder to contain. More trade meant more traffic. More people meant more waste. More prosperity meant more goods entering through streets never designed for such volume. Success itself deepened the problem. The very towns people admired for wealth and opportunity could be the hardest places to keep under control. London, for example, was not only politically important. It was physically overwhelming. Animals, river traffic, foreign goods, craftsmen, courts, pilgrims, merchants, servants, laborers, all pressing through spaces that struggled to hold them. Its streets reflected its ambition and its strain at the same time. And when a city reaches that scale, one question becomes impossible to avoid. If the streets themselves are carrying too much, what happens to the people whose entire lives depend on never being able to step away from them at all? The servants, laborers, porters, sweepers, carters, and the urban poor who lived closest to the ground, and therefore closest to every consequence. For them, the street was not something crossed on the way to life. It was life itself. There was no clean separation between work and filth, between private dignity and public inconvenience, because survival depended on staying inside the very spaces others tried hardest to escape. The urban poor lived closest to the street in every sense. Their homes were smaller, more crowded, and often structurally weaker. They were more likely to occupy lower-quality housing near busy roads, unstable drainage, workshops, or places wealthier residents preferred to avoid. They had fewer servants, fewer spare clothes, fewer protected courtyards, fewer private wells, and fewer opportunities to withdraw from the constant contact of urban life. When the street flooded, they felt it first. When food quality dropped, they absorbed the risk first. When disease spread, distance was a luxury they did not possess. This is one of the least romantic parts of medieval urban history, and perhaps one of the most important. We often speak about medieval towns as shared environments, but shared never meant equal. A merchant and a porter could walk the same lane and experience two entirely different cities. One might see inconvenience. The other might see wages, danger, and the limit of his body. Take the porter, for example. Porters carried the city on their backs. Grain sacks, barrels of ale, crates of fish, cloth bundles, firewood, building stone, household goods, market deliveries, and whatever else needed movement through streets too narrow, too muddy, or too crowded for efficient carts. Their labor turned urban trade into physical endurance. Imagine carrying a heavy barrel through a lane already slick with rain and dung, stepping around animals, avoiding broken paving, trying not to damage expensive goods that do not belong to you. One bad slip could mean injury, lost pay, or accusation. The street was not scenery. It was resistance. Carters faced a different but equally exhausting struggle. Carts were essential, but medieval streets were not designed for smooth efficiency. Narrow passages, uneven surfaces, crowding, mud, drainage channels, and the simple unpredictability of animals turned transport into negotiation. A wheel stuck in a rut delayed not just one delivery, but the movement around it. A blocked lane could ripple outward through trade. This is why towns cared so fiercely about obstructions. A staircase projecting too far, a heap of refuse left too long, a merchant using too much public space. These were not minor annoyances when movement itself was economic survival. Street order was commerce. For sweepers and laborers tasked with cleaning public spaces, the irony was sharper still. They worked closest to the filth and were often least protected from it. Their labor made civic dignity possible, yet their own social status remained low. Like those who emptied cesspits, they were necessary without being admired. History has a habit of praising cathedrals and forgetting the people who made the approach to the cathedral passable. Domestic servants occupied another strange position. A servant in a prosperous household might live closer to comfort than many laborers, but much of their work involved managing the boundary between the household and the street. Fetching water, carrying refuse, shopping in markets, protecting clothing, cleaning floors, maintaining entrances, handling the practical details that allowed wealth to feel separate from urban disorder. Respectability often rested on invisible labor performed by people whose own lives were far less protected. This meant class was constantly rehearsed through cleanliness. A noblewoman appearing in carefully maintained clothing, a merchant receiving guests in an orderly hall, a guild master presenting household dignity. None of this existed without someone managing mud, laundry, waste, firewood, food storage, and the thousand small frictions between ideal appearance and physical reality. Cleanliness was not just virtue. It was labor disguised as atmosphere. Women, particularly those managing households, carried much of this burden. Whether wealthy or poor, domestic order was deeply gendered in expectation. The state of the threshold, the smell of the room, the quality of bread, the condition of linen, the visible competence of the household, all could reflect on female responsibility fairly or unfairly. A widow trying to maintain respectability without male income faced this pressure acutely. Disorder around the home could invite judgment quickly. Poverty could be mistaken for neglect. Misfortune could be read as moral weakness. The street was public, but its judgments entered private life with unsettling speed. Children also moved through this hierarchy early. Poorer children were more visible in the street because the street itself functioned as workplace, playground, and social world. They ran errands, carried goods, scavenged, assisted trades, watched animals, and learned urban survival long before adulthood. Wealthier children were not absent from the street, but they had more controlled pathways through it. Again, the same city produced different childhoods. And then there were those whose relationship to the street was even more precarious. Beggars, migrants, the sick, widows without support, displaced laborers, and those suspended between belonging and exclusion. Medieval towns attracted hope, but they also concentrated vulnerability. A city could offer work and still leave people sleeping close to the very walls that represented prosperity. For them, street filth was not just inconvenience. It was environment. Rain meant cold bedding. Market waste meant possible food. A church doorway offered temporary shelter. Public charity and public suspicion lived side by side. The same people who gave alms might complain about visible poverty near important streets. Compassion and nuisance often occupied the same sentence. This reveals another truth about urban cleanliness. People wanted disorder managed, but not always its causes solved. Moving the poor away from a market square could matter more than changing the conditions that produced poverty. Sweeping a visible lane could matter more than addressing what made it constantly dirty. The appearance of order often satisfied authority faster than justice did. Hospitals, almshouses, monasteries, and parish charities formed part of this system, but resources were uneven and expectations limited. Medieval compassion was real, but it was shaped by practical limits, religious duty, and social hierarchy. Streets remained the place where these tensions could not be hidden. Even entertainment reflected class through space. Taverns, alehouses, public festivals, and seasonal fairs brought different social groups into temporary proximity, but not equality. Wealth could purchase privacy even inside public life. Better rooms, better entrances, cleaner accommodations, safer travel. The poor remained more exposed to the shared body of the street. This is why weather mattered differently depending on who you were. Rain for a wealthy merchant might mean delayed deliveries and muddy shoes. Rain for a day laborer could mean lost wages, soaked clothing, and food uncertainty. Winter cold for a comfortable household meant inconvenience around fuel and drafts. We often speak about medieval towns as shared environments, but shared never meant equal. A merchant and a porter could walk the same lane and experience two entirely different cities. One might see inconvenience. The other might see wages, danger, and the limit of his body. Take the porter, for example. Porters carried the city on their backs. Grain sacks, barrels of ale, crates of fish, cloth bundles, firewood, building stone, household goods, market deliveries, and whatever else needed movement through streets too narrow, too muddy, or too crowded for efficient carts. Their labor turned urban trade into physical endurance. Imagine carrying a heavy barrel through a lane already slick with rain and dung, stepping around animals, avoiding broken paving, trying not to damage expensive goods that do not belong to you. One bad slip could mean injury, lost pay, or accusation. The street was not scenery. It was resistance. Carters faced a different but equally exhausting struggle. Carts were essential, but medieval streets were not designed for smooth efficiency. Narrow passages, uneven surfaces, crowding, mud, drainage channels, and the simple unpredictability of animals turned transport into negotiation. A wheel stuck in a rut delayed not just one delivery, but the movement around it. A blocked lane could ripple outward through trade. This is why towns cared so fiercely about obstructions. A staircase projecting too far, a heap of refuse left too long, a merchant using too much public space. These were not minor annoyances when movement itself was economic survival. Street order was commerce. For sweepers and laborers tasked with cleaning public spaces, the irony was sharper still. They worked closest to the filth and were often least protected from it. Their labor made civic dignity possible, yet their own social status remained low. Like those who emptied cesspits, they were necessary without being admired. History has a habit of praising cathedrals and forgetting the people who made the approach to the cathedral passable. Domestic servants occupied another strange position. A servant in a prosperous household might live closer to comfort than many laborers, but much of their work involved managing the boundary between the household and the street. Fetching water, carrying refuse, shopping in markets, protecting clothing, cleaning floors, maintaining entrances, handling the practical details that allowed wealth to feel separate from urban disorder. Respectability often rested on invisible labor performed by people whose own lives were far less protected. This meant class was constantly rehearsed through cleanliness. A noblewoman appearing in carefully maintained clothing, a merchant receiving guests in an orderly hall, a guild master presenting household dignity. None of this existed without someone managing mud, laundry, waste, firewood, food storage, and the thousand small frictions between ideal appearance and physical reality. Cleanliness was not just virtue. It was labor disguised as atmosphere. Women, particularly those managing households, carried much of this burden. Whether wealthy or poor, domestic order was deeply gendered in expectation. The state of the threshold, the smell of the room, the quality of bread, the condition of linen, the visible competence of the household, all could reflect on female responsibility fairly or unfairly. A widow trying to maintain respectability without male income faced this pressure acutely. Disorder around the home could invite judgment quickly. Poverty could be mistaken for neglect. Misfortune could be read as moral weakness. The street was public, but its judgments entered private life with unsettling speed. Children also moved through this hierarchy early. Poorer children were more visible in the street because the street itself functioned as workplace, playground, and social world. They ran errands, carried goods, scavenged, assisted trades, watched animals, and learned urban survival long before adulthood. Wealthier children were not absent from the street, but they had more controlled pathways through it. Again, the same city produced different childhoods. And then there were those whose relationship to the street was even more precarious. Beggars, migrants, the sick, widows without support, displaced laborers, and those suspended between belonging and exclusion. Medieval towns attracted hope, but they also concentrated vulnerability. A city could offer work and still leave people sleeping close to the very walls that represented prosperity. For them, street filth was not just inconvenience. It was environment. Rain meant cold bedding. Market waste meant possible food. A church doorway offered temporary shelter. Public charity and public suspicion lived side by side. The same people who gave alms might complain about visible poverty near important streets. Compassion and nuisance often occupied the same sentence. This reveals another truth about urban cleanliness. People wanted disorder managed, but not always its causes solved. Moving the poor away from a market square could matter more than changing the conditions that produced poverty. Sweeping a visible lane could matter more than addressing what made it constantly dirty. The appearance of order often satisfied authority faster than justice did. Hospitals, almshouses, monasteries, and parish charities formed part of this system, but resources were uneven and expectations limited. Medieval compassion was real, but it was shaped by practical limits, religious duty, and social hierarchy. Streets remained the place where these tensions could not be hidden. Even entertainment reflected class through space. Taverns, alehouses, public festivals, and seasonal fairs brought different social groups into temporary proximity, but not equality. Wealth could purchase privacy even inside public life. Better rooms, better entrances, cleaner accommodations, safer travel. The poor remained more exposed to the shared body of the street. This is why weather mattered differently depending on who you were. Rain for a wealthy merchant might mean delayed deliveries and muddy shoes. Rain for a day laborer could mean lost wages, soaked clothing, and food uncertainty. Winter cold for a comfortable household meant inconvenience around fuel and drafts. For the poor, it meant survival measured one night at a time. The street was the same. The consequences were not. Disease followed these inequalities with brutal honesty. When illness moved through towns, the poor were rarely spared by luck. Crowded housing, weaker nutrition, less ability to isolate, and constant exposure made vulnerability structural. During outbreaks, authorities might focus on visible nuisances, refuse heaps, suspicious smells, wandering animals. But the deeper issue was often the unequal ability to protect oneself. And yet blame frequently traveled downward. It was easier to accuse the visibly poor of disorder than to question the broader systems producing it. Certain districts became associated with moral suspicion as much as practical concern. Dirt became social accusation. The language of cleanliness could quietly become the language of exclusion. This should feel familiar because cities across history have repeated it in different forms. Still, we should be careful not to flatten medieval life into pure misery. Even among hardship, there was neighborhood loyalty, humor, mutual aid, and ordinary pride. People borrowed tools, shared ovens, watched children, exchanged gossip, argued fiercely, and defended one another when needed. Dense living created friction, but it also created community. A narrow lane full of smells and complaints could still be home. This matters because survival was rarely individual. People endured difficult streets partly because they endured them together. A widow might rely on a neighbor for water. A laborer might sleep in shared lodging. A baker's apprentice knew which household would quietly extend credit in a bad week. Reputation could wound, but belonging could also protect. The medieval street was harsh, but it was also relational. You were known there, sometimes too well, but being known meant your absence was noticed too. Illness, debt, grief, celebration. These were not hidden behind modern privacy. They moved visibly through thresholds, market stalls, church paths, and shared routines. This is one reason funerals were so powerful. Death moved through the same streets as trade. Bodies passed neighbors who had seen the illness unfold. Church bells marked not abstraction, but a specific life from a specific doorway. The muddy road to burial was not symbolic because someone wrote it that way. It was symbolic because everyone had walked it. And weddings, too, transformed the same streets. Processions, laughter, temporary decoration, borrowed clothing carefully protected from ordinary mud. Moments of joy depended on the same difficult infrastructure. Celebration was never separate from the street, passed through it. This constant overlap between beauty and inconvenience may be the most honest part of medieval urban life. Sacred and dirty, public and intimate, necessary and frustrating. Nothing remained pure for long because everything lived close together. And nowhere was that closeness more visible than in the animals themselves. Not just the horses and oxen everyone expected, but pigs in lanes, dogs in markets, chickens near thresholds, and the quieter creatures like rats that turned every effort at order into a permanent argument. Because if the medieval street belonged to people, it also belonged to animals, and often the animals were better adapted to it than anyone else. And in many ways, animals explained the street better than any city ordinance ever could, because they made visible what the town actually was. Not a clean human system disrupted by occasional mess, but a shared ecosystem where labor, waste, food, and survival moved constantly between species. A modern city often tries to hide this relationship. Medieval towns could not. Horses were the most obvious presence. They pulled carts, carried merchants, transported officials, served messengers, hauled building materials, and made trade physically possible. A prosperous town depended on them, and horses announced that dependence loudly, with hooves on stone, with blocked lanes, with the smell of stables carried into ordinary streets, and with the unavoidable fact that large working animals leave large evidence behind them. Horse dung was not a rare nuisance. It was part of the daily landscape. A busy street could be marked by it almost as reliably as by shop signs. People stepped around it, carts rolled through it, rain spread it, pigs investigated it, and sweepers cursed it. The more commercially successful a road was, the more likely it was to be full of the consequences of movement. Efficiency had a smell. Oxen played a quieter but equally important role. Stronger, slower, and often associated with heavier transport. They moved goods that shaped urban life from beneath its glamour: timber, stone, grain, barrels, and supplies too heavy for ordinary carrying. Their pace influenced the rhythm of streets. A narrow lane could belong to an ox cart for longer than anyone preferred. Impatience, of course, is not a modern invention. Arguments over blocked roads, damaged paving, and stubborn animals were probably as common as arguments over traffic today, only with more mud and fewer polite allusions. A merchant late for business did not care that an ox was philosophically committed to moving slowly. But pigs were perhaps the most revealing animals of all. To modern viewers, pigs wandering urban streets sound almost absurd, like a detail too theatrical to be true. Yet in many medieval towns, pigs were practical scavengers. They ate refuse. They turned waste into usable flesh. They represented household wealth in a form that could feed itself, at least partly, by participating in the city's own overflow. This made them useful and deeply unpopular at the same time. A pig rooting through refuse was solving one problem and creating another. It reduced waste but increased unpredictability. It wandered, dirted, it frightened horses. It disrupted markets. It ignored boundaries with admirable confidence. Town regulations repeatedly tried to control pigs, which usually means pigs repeatedly ignored those regulations with the help of their owners. There are stories, sometimes grimly memorable, of pigs causing injuries or accidents, especially involving children. Whether every tale was common or some were amplified by moral anxiety, the broader truth remains. Pigs were not background decoration. They were urban participants, and like many participants in city life, they were tolerated until they became too visible. Dogs occupied a stranger social position. Some were useful guard animals, hunting companions, protectors of property. Others drifted closer to scavengers, following butchers, haunting markets, surviving on scraps and opportunity. They belonged and did not belong at the same time. A butcher's district without dogs would have felt unnatural. Their presence reflected both necessity and disorder. Dogs also reveal something about medieval sensory life. They were early warning systems. Barking signaled strangers, disturbances, fire, night movement, and ordinary suspicion. A quiet lane and a barking lane told different stories. Sound once again shaped urban understanding. Chickens and geese added smaller forms of chaos. They moved through thresholds, courtyards, and edges of public space, blurring the boundary between domestic and civic life. Eggs, meat, feathers, and noise all arrived together. Their presence reminds us that household economy was often visible from the street. Livelihood was not hidden behind private walls. It crossed the doorway every morning. And then there were cats. Cats occupy a peculiar place in popular imagination, sometimes romanticized, sometimes trapped inside later myths about superstition. In reality, they were often valued for a very practical reason. Rats. Grain stores, kitchens, bakeries, breweries, monasteries, merchant warehouses. Everywhere food gathered, rats followed. Cats were less symbols than workers, because rats were the true argument beneath everything. They were rarely the dramatic center of medieval urban description because they were too ordinary. But rats were everywhere structure and food allowed them to be. They lived in walls, beneath floors, near drains, around stables, in storehouses, near docks, and behind markets. They made every attempt at cleanliness feel temporary. A household might sweep, store carefully, and still hear movement at night. This is one of the quiet truths of pre-modern life. Victory over pests was rarely permanent. It was negotiated, partial, and exhausting. Rats were not an invasion. They were a condition. This shaped architecture itself. Storage mattered. Elevation mattered. Chests hanging food, cats, vigilance. People designed habits around creatures they could not fully defeat. Again, cleanliness was not perfection. It was maintenance under pressure. The presence of animals also complicated moral ideas about dirt. Animal waste could be useful. Animal proximity could be necessary. But animals also made visible the limits of control. A noble household might own fine horses and still smell like a stable from the wrong angle. A prosperous merchant could maintain clean public rooms while rats tested the cellar below. Respectability and animal reality were always negotiating. This is why elite ideals of refinement often included distance. Distance from visible labor, from slaughter, from manure, from noise, from the creatures that made comfort possible. Wealth often meant creating the illusion that food, transport, and household order appeared naturally rather than through constant animal involvement. But the street kept exposing the truth. Even royal entries into cities with banners, ceremony, and carefully prepared routes still required horses. Grand processions still left behind ordinary evidence. Power passed through manure like everyone else. There is something wonderfully leveling about that. Religious life also reflected this closeness. Animals near churches, geese wandering too near sacred processions, dogs interrupting solemnity. These were not necessarily signs of disrespect so much as reminders that medieval order was always practical before it was aesthetic. Sacred life existed inside ordinary material life, not above it. Monasteries themselves managed animals constantly. Gardens, fish ponds, livestock, transport animals, kitchens, waste systems. Even disciplined spiritual spaces could not escape the physical logic of food and maintenance. And then there was the question of slaughter. Most people today encounter meat after the difficult parts have been carefully hidden. Medieval towns did not offer that luxury. Animals were bought alive, moved publicly, killed nearby, processed visibly. Children saw it. Streets absorbed it. Markets smelled of it. This did not necessarily make people crueler. It made them less able to pretend distance. The relationship between consumption and death was shorter, clearer, and harder to ignore. Blood in the street was not automatically scandal. It was often part of ordinary provisioning. What mattered was whether it was managed well enough to remain ordinary. That phrase matters, managed well enough. Because medieval towns were full of systems that did not aim for perfection, only for tolerable function. Animals were not removed from urban life because urban life depended on them. The goal was balance, not purity. Sometimes that balance failed spectacularly. A frightened horse in a crowded market. A pig causing injury. A cart overturning in bad mud. A dead animal left too long in summer heat. A stable fire spreading faster because of dry straw. These moments reminded everyone how fragile the arrangement really was. The street was cooperative until suddenly it was not. And when crisis came, blame followed familiar paths. Was the owner careless? Was the animal improperly restrained? Did officials fail to enforce rules? Did neighbors tolerate too much? Disorder quickly became moral language again. This reveals something deeper about medieval urban psychology. People accepted a great deal of mess, but they wanted that mess to remain legible. Filth could be tolerated if it fit known patterns. Chaos became frightening when it escaped explanation. A pig in the lane was normal. A pig causing death was a civic problem. A stable smell was expected. A dead horse left rotting too long became accusation. Ordinary dirt was manageable because it had social meaning. Extraordinary disorder threatened trust. Even weather changed the behavior of animals in ways people had to read. Rain altered where pigs searched. Heat changed how quickly waste became dangerous. Winter pushed animals closer to shelter and humans closer to shared air. Seasonal intelligence included animal intelligence. You learned not only the street, but the habits of the creatures moving through it. This intimate knowledge was part of citizenship, whether formal or not. To belong to a medieval town was to understand its non-human residents too. The butcher's dogs, the pigs everyone complained about but someone clearly kept feeding, the horse known for kicking, the geese near a certain yard, the rats in the grain store, the cat that seemed to belong to no one and therefore everyone. Cities were social not just because of people, but because life crowded together across boundaries we now prefer to separate. And perhaps that is why medieval streets feel so strange to us. They were not merely dirtier versions of our own roads. They were organized around a different assumption: that life would be visible. Waste would be visible. Labor would be visible. Animals would be visible. The systems supporting comfort would not disappear politely behind walls. Modern cleanliness often depends on distance from slaughter, from waste removal, from food production, from the bodies of working animals. Medieval streets offered far less distance. They insisted that survival had texture, smell, and noise. And when those streets were busiest, on market mornings, feast days, or after harvest, this truth became impossible to ignore. Animals, merchants, servants, pilgrims, laborers, priests, children, carts, refuse, bells, and arguments all compressed into the same limited space. At that point, the street stopped looking like a road at all and became something closer to a living organism. Breathing, crowded, unpredictable, and always on the edge of either productivity or collapse. Which is why one sudden storm, one broken bridge, or 1 week of relentless rain could transform the entire balance and reveal just how little separated ordinary medieval life from urban paralysis. That kind of paralysis was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It rarely arrived with a single heroic moment. More often, it began quietly, with wheels sinking deeper than usual, with deliveries arriving late, with a lane people trusted yesterday becoming unreliable today. Medieval towns were vulnerable not because they were constantly collapsing, but because ordinary function depended on countless small things continuing to work. Rain was one of the most powerful forces in this entire system. A modern city treats rain as inconvenience. A medieval town often treated it as negotiation. Too little water and wells became uncertain, gardens struggled, and the smell of accumulated waste thickened under dry heat. Too much rain and streets softened into resistance. Drainage failed, and movement itself became labor. After several days of hard rain, an unpaved lane could stop behaving like a road altogether. Carts cut deep grooves that filled again with water. Foot traffic churned edges into unstable mud. Animals made the surface worse simply by existing. Refuse spread outward instead of remaining contained. A gutter that worked in theory disappeared beneath overflow. And because streets connected everything, disruption spread quickly. If a baker's flour arrived late, bread changed. If fish reached market more slowly, suspicion followed. If firewood became harder to transport, kitchens and workshops felt it. If church access became difficult for the elderly or sick, even spiritual routine shifted. The street was not just infrastructure. It was the timetable of daily life. This is one reason bridges mattered with almost emotional intensity. A bridge was not simply architecture. It was certainty. It turned dangerous weather into manageable movement. It preserved trade routes, marriages, legal obligations, pilgrimage paths, and ordinary errands. When a bridge failed, people did not just lose convenience. They lost confidence in the shape of the town. And bridges failed more often than romantic memory prefers. Floods undermined foundations. Ice damaged supports. Timber rotted. Heavy use wore everything faster. Repairs were expensive and often politically sensitive. Who paid for the bridge was never a neutral question. Merchants wanted access. Authorities wanted order. Local residents wanted fairness. Travelers wanted passage. Everyone loved the bridge most when someone else funded it. A damaged bridge also changed social geography. Suddenly, the longer route mattered. Certain districts became harder to reach. Markets shifted. Taverns near alternative crossings grew busier. A physical break created new patterns of advantage and inconvenience almost overnight. This reminds us again that medieval urban life was never static. A city reorganized itself around damage with remarkable speed. Winter created a different kind of difficulty. Cold, hardened mud, which could briefly feel like relief, until ice turned streets into hazards of another sort. Wheels slipped. Animals stumbled. Water sources froze or became harder to access. Waste removal slowed. People and animals moved closer together for warmth, thickening air and smell indoors. Fire became more necessary and more dangerous. A frozen street might look cleaner than a wet one, but appearances could deceive. Beneath winter order sat delayed problems waiting for thaw. The first warm days after a hard winter could be surprisingly unpleasant. Ice released what it had hidden. Drains resumed reluctantly. Roads softened again. Stored refuse had to be dealt with. Winter did not solve urban filth. Paused parts of it. Summer, meanwhile, turned patience into a shorter resource. Heat sharpened smell and suspicion. Meat spoiled faster. Water stagnated. Flies became active accomplices in discomfort. A lane that was tolerable in cool weather could become oppressive in August. People noticed not only the presence of dirt, but its speed. Rot felt faster, closer, more personal. This is why many regulations sound seasonal even when not written that way. Enforcement often followed the calendar of discomfort. People tolerated in February what they condemned in July. Harvest seasons added their own strange pressure. More goods entered town. Carts increased. Temporary abundance produced temporary chaos. Grain, vegetables, animals, fruit, and labor all moved through streets already carrying normal urban strain. Success was heavy. Prosperity arrived on wheels that damaged roads. This created one of the central contradictions of medieval towns. The moments of greatest economic vitality often produced the greatest physical disorder. A quiet street might be cleaner because nothing important was happening there. Feast days and fairs intensified this further. Pilgrims arrived. Traders from outside entered unfamiliar lanes. Animals crowded market edges. Temporary stalls appeared. Waste increased faster than ordinary routines could absorb it. Yet these were also moments of pride, income, and civic identity. No town wanted to seem too small, too poor, or too disordered to host people well. So preparation became performance. Streets were swept more carefully. Routes to churches, guild halls, and official buildings received attention. Market fronts were managed. Repairs that had somehow waited for months suddenly became urgent because important eyes were coming. This tells us something very human. Cleanliness often accelerates in the presence of witnesses. Medieval towns were no different. A royal visit, a bishop's procession, a marriage alliance, or a major religious celebration could temporarily create the cleanest version of a place. Not because people suddenly discovered order, but because dignity required concentration. And once the witnesses left, ordinary gravity returned. There is no insult in that. It is simply how maintenance works when resources are limited. Permanent perfection is expensive. Temporary respectability is achievable. Flooding, however, ignored ceremony entirely. Rivers were blessings until they became arguments. Towns often grew near water for obvious reasons: trade, transport, mills, drinking supply, fishing. But rivers were partners with moods. Heavy rain upstream could change a quiet street without warning. Low districts flooded first. Cellars filled. Waste mixed with water and moved unpredictably. Bridges strained. Warehouses feared loss. The smell afterward was its own chapter. Flooding revealed class with painful clarity. Those with strong stone buildings and elevated storage lost less. Those in weaker structures near poorer drainage or dependent on street-level trade lost quickly. A merchant might survive inconvenience. A poor household might lose bedding, food, and the fragile stability of an already narrow margin. And still, people rebuilt. This repeated rebuilding is worth lingering on because it challenges the false idea that medieval people were passive sufferers of bad conditions. They were not passive. They were extraordinarily practiced at recovery. They patched walls, redug ditches, reset paving, salvaged wood, argued over compensation, borrowed tools, and resumed trade because resuming trade was survival. Resilience did not look noble. It looked like work the next morning. This rhythm shaped memory itself. People remembered storms not only by rain, but by what followed. The year the bridge washed out. The winter when carts could not reach market. The summer when the fish spoiled faster than usual. The feast day ruined by mud. Weather became biography. It also shaped law. Repeated environmental problems produced repeated civic responses. More rules about drainage. More fines for obstruction. More pressure to pave important routes. More concern about who maintained walls, ditches, and crossings. Government often looks grand in history books, but much of government was deciding whose problem water should become. That question never really disappeared. Monasteries, guilds, landlords, parishes, merchants, householders. Everyone could be drawn into disputes over roads and runoff. Water had no respect for legal boundaries. It moved downhill and took arguments with it. This also explains why some of the most valued urban improvements were not spectacular at all. A properly maintained drain could matter more than a beautiful facade. A stable crossing point could matter more than decorative stone. Function created dignity before appearance did. People noticed what let them move without humiliation. A clean approach to church mattered because it protected shoes, clothing, and social composure. A reliable market road mattered because it preserved trade and trust. A repaired bridge mattered because it prevented whole sections of life from becoming longer, riskier, and more expensive. Urban pride often began with not getting stuck. There is something almost wonderfully unromantic about that, and therefore deeply trustworthy. Medieval people were not dreaming all day about grand abstractions. They were often trying to keep carts moving, floors dry, and dinner possible. And yet these practical concerns shaped politics as much as kings and wars did. A ruler entering a wealthy city judged not only its walls and churches, but its functioning streets. Merchants judged opportunities by access. Pilgrims judged hospitality by the physical experience of arrival. Diplomacy, commerce, and reputation all passed through mud before reaching parchment. The street was foreign policy at ground level. Even military movement depended on it. Troops, supplies, messengers, and official authority all required passable roads and bridges. A town that could not move goods could not easily defend wealth. Cleanliness and security were more connected than they first appear. This becomes especially clear during scarcity. When harvests failed, when war disrupted supply routes, when plague reduced labor, the same streets that once carried abundance now carried anxiety. Empty market stalls looked different from crowded ones. A muddy road without carts felt ominous. Silence could be more frightening than noise. People understood absence as clearly as presence. A town was supposed to sound alive. Animals, wheels, vendors, bells, complaints. When that rhythm faltered, people noticed. Disorder was familiar. Emptiness was unsettling. This is one of the quiet psychological truths of medieval urban life. People could tolerate filth more easily than uncertainty. A dirty market still meant food might be found. A silent one suggested something worse. And so, again and again, towns fought not for beauty first, but for continuity, for the ordinary functioning that allowed people to believe tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to survive it. That fight was visible in paving stones, drains, bridges, and thresholds. But it was perhaps most visible in the people who rose before dawn to make ordinary life possible. The bakers heating ovens, the carters testing the roads, the servants stepping into uncertain weather, the sweepers clearing yesterday so the town could begin again. Because every medieval morning started with a question the street would answer first. How difficult would life be today? And for most people, that answer came before sunrise, long before the formal life of the town appeared to begin. The street announced itself in darkness first, in the sound of wheels testing the road, in the cautious steps of servants carrying water, in the stable noise of animals already impatient for the day, and in the simple question of whether the ground outside the door would cooperate. A baker often knew before anyone else. Bread could not wait for comfort. Ovens needed heat early. Flour had to be handled before the market stirred fully awake, and delivery depended on streets still half-owned by shadows. If heavy rain had turned the lane to deep mud, flour carts arrived differently, slower, dirtier, and with more bad temper. If frost had hardened the road, movement might be easier for a few hours, until ice made confidence foolish. The baker's work began in the private space of the oven, but its success depended on the public condition of the street. This was true for almost everyone whose labor fed the town. Water carriers, brewers, milk sellers, fishmongers, laundresses, servants, charcoal men, wood sellers, all of them began with the same negotiation. Can today's roads be trusted? Before prices were argued, before bells marked the official rhythm of the day, the street had already decided what kind of day it intended to be. There is something revealing in that. Medieval urban life was less controlled by the clock than by friction. Delay was physical first. A servant sent for water might lose half an hour to a blocked crossing. A brewer waiting for fuel might discover the cart had sunk axle-deep outside the gate. A fish seller might arrive just late enough for suspicion to ruin the morning's trade. None of this was dramatic history in the usual sense, but it was the real architecture of ordinary stress. And stress, repeated daily, shapes a civilization as surely as law. Consider laundry, for example. A task so ordinary it disappears from most grand historical narratives, and yet one that reveals the city perfectly. Clothing was expensive, necessary, and constantly under attack from the street. Mud climbed hems. Smoke settled into wool. Grease found sleeves. Rain changed everything. Washing garments required water, fuel, labor, space for drying, and time. It was not casual maintenance. It was an organized domestic campaign. Laundresses understood the city differently from merchants or officials. They knew where water was usable, where access was contested, where runoff made certain places impossible, and which households could afford cleanliness as a regular performance rather than an emergency correction. Linen told social truth. White linen in particular had a moral force. It suggested discipline, means, and visible order. A clean shirt cuff or well-kept household cloth was not vanity alone. It was evidence. Respectability was often announced in fabric before words, which makes it even more striking that all of it still had to pass through streets that worked against it. There is a quiet comedy in history there. A society capable of intense concern about appearance, navigating roads determined to ruin appearances by noon. Shoemakers lived inside that contradiction too. Footwear in a medieval town was not simply fashion or protection. It was strategy. Good shoes mattered because the street punished weak ones immediately. Leather absorbed damp, mud damaged stitching. Poor soles failed under constant uneven ground. Repairs were frequent. A shoemaker was not serving vanity so much as urban survival. And wealth could often be measured by how many times a person could afford repair before replacement became impossible. Wood sellers and charcoal men carried another kind of importance. Fuel was warmth, cooking, brewing, trade, and winter endurance. But fuel was heavy. Moving it through narrow lanes required patience, labor, and arguments with space itself. A household without enough fuel was not merely inconvenienced. It was vulnerable. Again, the street determined domestic life before anyone sat by the hearth. This is one reason medieval mornings were often noisy so early. Silence belonged less to cities than we imagine. Work required preparation, and preparation required movement. Hooves, shouted instructions, deliveries, doors opening, animals resisting cooperation. Urban life began in layers before daylight fully admitted it. Even prayer moved inside this practical reality. Church bells called people toward spiritual rhythm, but getting there still meant mud, cold, smell, and whatever the lane had become overnight. Devotion did not float above inconvenience. It stepped through it. A parish church was part of the street's geography, not an escape from it. This made religious routine feel physically grounded. Sunday best meant more when the road actively threatened it. Processions were more meaningful because dignity had to be carried through ordinary disorder. Reverence did not require cleanliness. It required persistence. And persistence defined women's work in ways often hidden by simpler histories. Fetching water, managing washing, food preparation, floor maintenance, caring for children in close urban conditions, negotiating neighbors, preserving household respectability. These tasks were not background domestic details. They were logistical expertise. A well-run household in a difficult town was an achievement of constant adjustment. The street entered the kitchen every day. Water quality shaped cooking. Market timing shaped meals. Mud shaped fuel access. Weather shaped preservation. Rats shaped storage. Smell shaped appetite. Household management was not separate from civic infrastructure. It was civic infrastructure on the scale of one family. Widows, especially, lived inside this truth. Without stable male income or protection, a widow's ability to maintain threshold, clothing, food quality, and visible order became socially loaded. Disorder could invite pity, but also suspicion. Could she manage? Was the house slipping? Were debts accumulating? In a close urban world, decline was difficult to hide. Yet many widows were economically capable, practical, and deeply experienced managers of urban life. They knew markets, neighbors, credit, and routines with a precision outsiders often lacked. The city could be harsh to them, but it also gave forms of agency unavailable elsewhere. Again, contradiction sat in the doorway. Apprentices reveal another side of the morning city. Before they became masters, before they gained status or independence, they learned through errands, repetition, and the physical discipline of urban movement. Carry this, deliver that, clean here, sweep there. Watch how the master handles customers. Watch how the household protects its goods. Watch how the street punishes carelessness. Apprenticeship was education through geography. A young apprentice learned not only a trade, but the map of responsibility. Which customers paid late, which alley flooded first, which supplier arrived angry, which market stall could be trusted, which shortcut ruined shoes but saved time. Urban intelligence was not theoretical. It was walked. Children outside formal apprenticeship learned similar lessons less politely. Poorer children were often part of the street economy early. Carrying, selling, scavenging, assisting, observing. They learned quickly what could be picked up, what should be avoided, which adults were generous, and which animals were dangerous. Survival trained attention. This makes medieval childhood feel less sheltered than modern imagination prefers, but not necessarily less human. Children still played, still found humor, still created games around the same streets adults complained about. Mud can be misery or entertainment depending on age and responsibility. The street contained both. And then there were the sounds of authority. The watchman at night, the market inspector by morning, the official complaint delivered to a neighbor, the public announcement shouted where everyone could hear. Government in medieval towns was often audible before it was visible. Rules moved through voices. A proclamation about street cleaning mattered because it entered ordinary hearing. A fine mattered because everyone nearby understood the embarrassment. Public life was enforced through attention. This is why shame worked so efficiently. A person known for neglecting frontage, allowing dangerous obstruction, or selling bad goods did not simply face legal penalty. They faced memory. People remembered. Streets were social archives. That memory could be generous too. A household known for lending tools, helping during floods, or keeping a respectable threshold through hardship earned trust that law could not provide. Reputation was infrastructure of another kind, and reputation often depended on the smallest visible details. A swept step, a properly repaired gutter, a child in decent clothing, a dog kept under control, a shop entrance that did not insult customers. These things signaled competence long before formal status did. Cities read surfaces carefully. This may be why travelers sometimes misunderstood medieval towns. Visitors saw dirt first because dirt was obvious. Residents saw reliability first. Which baker delivered honestly? Which bridge could be trusted after rain? Which landlord ignored repairs? Which tavern watered ale? Which priest visited the sick? Filth was visible, but trust determined survival. To live there was to read beneath appearances. A narrow lane with bad smell might still contain the best bread. A fine frontage might hide debt. A crowded market might signal prosperity rather than danger. Medieval urban judgment required patience. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson of these streets. They resist simple moral categories. Dirty did not always mean neglected. Clean did not always mean safe. Noise could signal abundance. Silence could signal fear. A pig in the lane could be a nuisance or tomorrow's dinner. Everything depended on context. This is what modern viewers often miss when imagining medieval filth. We tend to treat dirt as evidence of backwardness, as though cleanliness naturally arrives once intelligence appears. But medieval people were not confused about discomfort. They were managing a world where infrastructure, labor, weather, and survival were tightly bound together. They did not fail to invent our standards. They lived inside different constraints. And if we follow those constraints far enough, we reach perhaps the most revealing place of all. Not the market, not the bridge, not the muddy lane, but the town edge itself, where the city tried to decide what belonged inside and what had to be pushed just beyond the walls. Because every medieval town, no matter how crowded, eventually asked the same uneasy question. What parts of life are necessary, but too unpleasant to keep close? That question shaped the edges of every town more than most visitors realized, because the walls of a medieval city did not simply separate safety from danger. They also separated visibility from discomfort. Some things had to happen for urban life to function, but people preferred them slightly farther away, close enough to serve the town, distant enough not to dominate its daily dignity. This is where tanners often ended up. Tanning leather was essential. Shoes, belts, harnesses, book bindings, saddles, armor fittings, gloves, pouches. Leather touched nearly every part of life. A town without leather was a town without ordinary function. But tanning was one of the least pleasant trades to live beside. Raw hides arrived carrying the immediate memory of the animal. Hair had to be removed. Flesh had to be scraped. Hides were soaked, treated, stretched, washed, and processed using materials that could make entire streets smell like accusation. Urine, lime, stale water, decomposing organic matter. This was not a craft that hid politely behind a charming shopfront. So tanners were often pushed toward river edges, downstream positions, or the outer margins of town where water access was useful and complaints slightly less politically urgent. This tells us something important. Medieval towns did not ignore smell. They organized around it. The same was true for fullers, dyers, and others whose work involved soaking, beating, washing, or staining materials in ways that made nearby life more complicated. Cloth production, so central to many prosperous towns, depended on processes few wealthy citizens wanted directly beneath their windows. Again, prosperity and nuisance were inseparable. A fine merchant displaying imported cloth in a respectable market square depended on labor taking place somewhere less respectable nearby. Wealth often required geographic distance from the work that produced it. The same logic shaped slaughterhouses and some butcher spaces. Blood, offal, and animal remains were necessary facts of urban provisioning, but nobody wanted them too close to ceremonial centers if it could be avoided. Churches, guild halls, and wealthy streets preferred symbolic cleanliness. Practical mess was encouraged to drift outward. And beyond those edges sat another uncomfortable truth: cemeteries. Modern people often imagine medieval burial grounds as quiet, isolated places far from ordinary life, but the reality was often much closer and more crowded. Parish churchyards, urban burial spaces, and cemeteries were woven into daily movement. Death did not live outside the town. It lived near the church, near prayer, near the routines of the living. Yet, as populations grew, burial itself became part of the urban question of space, smell, and proximity. Too many bodies in too little ground created anxiety. Disturbance of older graves, concerns about odor, practical overcrowding. These were not simply spiritual issues. They were physical ones. The dead, like waste, forced towns to confront limits of containment. This may sound harsh, but it reflects a broader medieval truth. Cities were always negotiating with material reality, even in sacred matters. Hospitals and leper houses reveal the same tension. Care for the sick was real, often shaped by religious duty and charity, but contagious illness also produced fear. Certain institutions were deliberately placed at town edges or just beyond gates, not always because people were cruel, but because proximity and distance were constantly being balanced against each other. Help needed access. Safety demanded space. The walls, then, were not clean moral lines. They were practical arguments built in stone. Outside the gate, you might find dung heaps, refuse areas, industrial trades, marginal housing, temporary encampments, burial grounds, and institutions dealing with conditions the town could not comfortably absorb at its center. Inside the gate, you found the same society trying to preserve the appearance of order. But of course, outside and inside were never truly separate. People moved constantly between them. Tanneries fed markets. Burial grounds served parish life. Waste removed from the center did not vanish into philosophy. The edges were not another world. They were the part of the city people preferred not to discuss during formal ceremonies. This should sound familiar. Every civilization creates distance between comfort and the labor or discomfort supporting it. Medieval towns simply made that distance shorter and harder to ignore. Town gates themselves became symbolic because of this. A gate controlled trade, security, taxation, and movement, but it also controlled narrative. Entering through a gate meant arriving through a curated first impression. Officials cared what visitors saw. Roads approaching gates mattered. Filth too close to arrival routes embarrassed the town. A prosperous city wanted to look prosperous before a visitor reached the market. This meant some streets were politically cleaner than others. Routes used by merchants, bishops, royal officials, or wealthy travelers received attention because visibility created pressure. Peripheral lanes where poor families lived could wait longer for repair. Infrastructure followed importance, and importance followed power. The city literally arranged dignity by direction. Travelers noticed this even if they did not always describe it directly. A town could impress at the gate and disappoint 2 streets later. Ceremonial order often thinned quickly into ordinary reality. But that performance still mattered. Reputation began at arrival. Pilgrimage routes made this even more significant. Towns on important religious roads needed strangers to trust them. Trust their markets, their lodgings, their churches, their bridges, their promises of hospitality. Pilgrims brought money and prestige, but also pressure. More feet, more animals, more demand, more waste, more witnesses. Success complicated cleanliness. A shrine attracting devotion could also attract overcrowding. Sacred fame produced practical mess. The route to holiness still passed by stables and drains. And in stood at the center of this contradiction and welcomed outsiders, which meant it concentrated exactly the things towns struggled to manage. Animals, food storage, drink, noise, servants, strangers, uncertain reputations, and constant turnover. A good, imbalanced hospitality with control. A bad one became a civic complaint. Travelers judged entire towns by the quality of sleep and breakfast available after crossing muddy roads. Urban reputation could rest on very ordinary discomforts. This is why stable management mattered so much. Horses arriving with merchants, pilgrims, or officials needed care immediately. Hay, water, manure, security, none of it was optional. An innkeeper was not simply selling a bed. He was temporarily managing part of the town's animal economy. Again, the street entered the room. Even universities and schools, where they existed, were shaped by these same realities. Students walked the same roads, complained about the same smells, and lived inside the same imperfect infrastructure. Intellectual life did not hover above the street. It argued beside it. There is something wonderfully grounding in that. Great theological debates still required passable shoes. Town walls also created a strange psychological comfort. Inside the walls, people could imagine order even if imperfectly. Outside them, danger could be projected more easily. Bandits, war, uncertainty, outsiders, disease, wilderness. But the irony was that much of the city's own discomfort came from within. The mud, smell, and civic frustration were domestic problems. People often fear the wrong direction. The real struggle of urban life was not usually invasion. It was maintenance, keeping drains clear, preventing fire, managing markets, handling poverty, repairing roads, negotiating neighbors. Walls could defend against armies. They could not force someone to clean a gutter. This is one reason civic pride attached so strongly to ordinary competence. A well-kept town was a moral statement. It suggested discipline, cooperation, prosperity, and divine favor all at once. Disorder suggested weakness, greed, neglect, or bad government. Streets became political philosophy written in mud. Chronicles sometimes hint at this without saying it directly. Praise for a ruler might include bridges repaired, roads improved, markets secured, drains managed. Governance was visible underfoot. Failure was equally visible. A blocked crossing, a rotting lane, a dangerous market, repeated flooding. These were not neutral inconveniences. They undermined trust in authority. If officials could not manage streets, what exactly were they managing? And ordinary people understood this perfectly. They might never read a charter, but they knew if the bridge still worked. They knew if prices rose because carts could not arrive. They knew if the church approach became embarrassing in rain. Political legitimacy was often measured in shoes. This also shaped rebellion. Urban unrest was rarely only ideological. Food shortages, unfair market practices, broken infrastructure, visible inequality. These created anger that could attach itself to larger political grievances. A town already frustrated by daily indignities became more combustible when crisis arrived. People endure hardship better when they believe hardship is shared fairly. When they stop believing that, mud becomes insult. This is why the street can tell us more about medieval society than many grander monuments. Cathedral reveals aspiration. A street reveals negotiation. It shows who is expected to step around problems and who has the power to move them. And often, that answer sat just outside the walls as clearly as inside them. Refuse mounds, tanning pits, burial grounds, poor housing, temporary shelters for laborers, roadside markets, and the uncertain spaces where town became countryside. All of these formed a kind of shadow city. Necessary, productive, and slightly denied. People passed through it constantly, but preferred not to define themselves by it. Yet the boundary was never fixed. Towns expanded. Walls were rebuilt farther out. Yesterday's unpleasant edge became tomorrow's respectable district. Prosperity literally changed the map. What one generation avoided, another generation built houses beside. This is another reason medieval streets resist simple judgment. They were not failed versions of modern planning. They were living systems adapting to growth faster than certainty could keep up. A lane known for tanners might, decades later, hold merchants. A once peripheral road could become central after trade shifted. A bridge rebuilt after flood might redirect an entire neighborhood's future. Urban history was geography in motion, and every change created new arguments about what belonged where, who deserved the cleaner road, which trade should move farther out, whether the market should expand, whether the poor should be displaced from valuable frontage, whether beauty mattered more than convenience. These questions were never really solved. They were inherited. And perhaps the most honest thing we can say about medieval streets is that they were not dirty because people had stopped caring. They were dirty because people cared about too many necessary things at once. Food, trade, warmth, safety, dignity, faith, profit, reputation, and all of them left marks on the ground. The town edge simply made that truth harder to hide. And if you wanted to see the full argument in one place, you often only had to stand at the gate at dawn. When carts from the countryside arrived, waste from yesterday still lingered, and the city had not yet had time to pretend it was cleaner than it really was. And perhaps that is the best place to leave it. Standing at the gate at dawn, before the market fully opens, before the church bells settle the morning into routine, before the sweepers have done what they can, and before the city has arranged itself into the respectable version it prefers visitors to see. At that hour, a medieval street is honest. The mud is still there from yesterday's rain. A cart will catches in a rut that no one has yet repaired. Horses breathe into the cold air. Somewhere, a baker is already working, and somewhere else a servant is stepping carefully around a gutter she knows too well. A pig is nosing at something better left undescribed. Smoke begins to rise from kitchens. The smell of damp straw, animals, ash, bread, and refuse mixes into something no modern perfume company would dare attempt. And yet people lived there, not as victims in a permanent nightmare and not as cheerful figures in a romantic painting, but as ordinary human beings doing what human beings always do. Adapting, complaining, negotiating, cleaning, failing, rebuilding, and trying again the next morning. That is what makes medieval streets so interesting. They were filthy, yes, sometimes shockingly so by modern standards. But they were also functional, social, necessary, and deeply understood by the people who used them. The dirt was not proof that nobody cared. It was often proof that too much life was happening in too little space, with too few tools to separate comfort from survival. A street carried everything: trade, gossip, prayer, waste, ambition, ceremony, animals, illness, weddings, funerals, and arguments about whose responsibility the puddle outside the door really was. It was never just a road. It was a public record of the town itself, its wealth and poverty, its labor and privilege, its pride and neglect, its practical intelligence and its daily compromises. You could read a city by its streets more honestly than by its monuments. A cathedral told you what people hoped to be. A street told you how they actually lived. And maybe that is the quiet lesson hidden beneath all the mud. Modern people often look backward and imagine that progress means escaping the discomforts of the past. And in many ways, it does. Cleaner water, better drainage, safer food, reliable sanitation. These are extraordinary achievements, and we should be grateful for them. But the medieval street reminds us that cleanliness itself is never simple. Someone still moves the waste. Someone still maintains the hidden systems. Someone still carries the cost of comfort. We have not escaped those truths so much as pushed them farther from view. The Middle Ages simply made them visible. The horse was in the road. The butcher worked nearby. The refuse had to go somewhere everyone could smell. The city could not pretend that life arrived clean and complete. It arrived muddy, loud, and inconvenient. There is a strange honesty in that. And perhaps that is why these streets stay with us. Not because they were exotic, but because beneath the obvious differences, they reveal something familiar. People then wanted dignity, order, safety, and a clean place to come home to, just as people do now. They argued about neighbors, worried about prices, judged local government by the condition of the road, and tried to protect small islands of comfort inside a world that rarely stayed tidy for long. History becomes more useful when it stops feeling like a costume drama and starts feeling like recognition. A muddy lane in medieval London, Paris, or York is not just a curiosity from another age. It is a reminder that civilization is often built less by grand speeches than by drains that work, bread that arrives on time, and someone deciding to sweep the step outside their own door. That kind of history is easy to overlook because it is ordinary. But ordinary life is where most people have always lived, and where most history has always happened. So the next time you imagine the medieval city, it may help not to begin with kings, castles, or shining stained glass. Begin instead with the street at first light. Begin with the sound of wheels in mud. Begin with a threshold being swept. Begin with the smell no one bothered to describe because everyone already knew it. That is where the real city was. And if one detail from this world surprised you most, or if there is another strange corner of everyday history you'd like us to explore next, tell me in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where everyone is watching from and what piece of the past still feels unexpectedly close. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the overlooked parts of history, subscribing is a simple way to stay with us for the next one. Until then, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.